do so because they sort of act like amoeba. Do you know what an amoeba is? These weird, jelly-like looking creatures that sort of feel their way in their environment. They kind of almost move like the slime that kids nowadays make. Moms probably know what I'm talking about. All right, did everybody sign in? So that is what's called amoeboid motion. All right, so here's a cross section of a blood vessel. All right, here's the vascular wall. And so here are these white blood cells that just freely move. They will actually make physical contact with the vascular wall and sort of exhibit this tumbling action. And then at some point, they're going to squeeze their way between cells, these cells up here, down here, squeeze between these cells to make it to the other side to where that injury might be in the tissue. All right. They get a lot of signals when you have some sort of injury. The injured tissue sends out lots of signals that will direct where these white blood cells need to go. Okay. Diapedesis and amoeboid movement. All right. Now, leukocytes can be classified depending on how they stain underneath a microscope. All right, and so the first group is called granular leukocytes because when they do stain, they pick up the stain very, very easily to the point where their cytoplasm almost has this grainy kind of appearance. Okay, hence granular. The second group can stain. You want to look at them underneath the microscope, but they don't stain as well as the granular leukocytes, so they're called agranular. Okay. So the first one, I'll just put all of them because people write. So the first granular leukocyte is an eosinophil. It's called an eosinophil, and this is like fluffy material, is because it's named after the stain that's used. It's called eosin. Okay, and so here eosin is a very acidic stain, and so it likes to typically stain sort of reddish, pinkish in color. And so eosinophils, being a white blood cell, is obviously going to be one that is going to help reduce the inflammatory process. Inflammation is sort of the body's way of telling you that something is wrong, all right? And so these eosinophils will dampen that response. Eosinophils are also the type of white blood cells that actually seek out kind of creepy, crawly sort of pathogens like pinworm, tapeworm, hookworm, all those nasty creatures that nobody wants to ever have. All right, so those are eosinophils. Basophils stain using a different type of stain, which tends to be basic in composition. So these are called basophils. And basophils, oddly enough, do the opposite of what eosinophils do in terms of the inflammatory process. They will want to increase inflammation. So they function to kind of make sure that that inflammatory response is on. And they do so by secreting histamine, right? Histamine is a signaling molecule that is indicative of inflammation. So when you have hay fever and you take Benadryl, being an antihistamine, it will dampen the production. Antihistamines dampen the effects of histamine, so you don't have inflammation. All right, and so one might think, well, why would a white blood cell ever want to cause or be part of that inflammatory process? Well, inflammation, as I said, is a way that the body tells you that something is wrong. And so having the inflammatory process is good, hence the basophil, up to a certain point. And then after that, you don't really want to have that inflammation. So hence the basophils sort of take over. The second thing that basophils also do is secrete another molecule called heparin. Heparin prevents blood clotting. Right? So if you guys already work as an aide or some sort of healthcare setting, sometimes they'll inject some heparin before they inject something else. That way the blood doesn't clot at the IV site. Some tubes that phlebotomists have, their tubes might be lined with heparin to prevent blood clotting before it reaches the laboratory. Okay? Neutrophils, okay, are sort of your first responders in any sort of infection. All right, neutrophils are the most numerous of certainly of the granular leukocytes. I'm not sure if it's the most numerous of all of them, but that wouldn't surprise me. And so these are the guys that will sacrifice themselves to make sure that the infection doesn't spread. All right, they secrete lysozyme, and that's a word I've tossed around maybe once at least. Lysozyme, thing like that. All right, and so lysozyme breaks things down. And so here's your first responders. They're going to be the ones that are trying to fight off those pathogens. Okay. Neutrophils, because they don't stain very well with either stain, even though it slightly does, at least very lightly. Okay. Any questions on granular? All right. Agranular leukocytes come in two flavors. The first one is called lymphocytes, and lymphocytes are important because they produce something called antibodies. All right. Anytime that you have an infection, your body is going to be ramping up some production of a particular type of antibody. And antibodies are really good because they recognize sort of identifying features of a particular pathogen. All right. That identifying feature found on all cells is called an antigen. Okay? So you don't have to be bacteria, you don't have to be a virus to have antigens as your identifying marker. All right? All cells have some sort of antigen on them. Okay? All right, so lymphocytes, important because they recognize this antigen on a pathogen and kind of target that particular pathogen for destruction. Okay? Easy enough, I think. All right, the last white blood cell that I'll talk about today are called monocytes. And monocytes and lymphocytes work really well together. All right, monocytes are probably the largest of the white blood cells. All right, these guys literally will engulf a particular pathogen through a process that you should know fairly well called phagocytosis. All right. So here you've got this huge cell that kind of engulfs another cell, aka bacteria, virus, chews it up, saves that antigen, all right, the ID marker, and presents that antigen to the lymphocyte for recognition. So these lymphocytes have their little manual, their little book of creepy crawly creatures. Flip through them, that's the one. All right, ramp up antibodies in order to target that particular pathogen for destruction.
Like chickenpox.
Say who?
Like chickenpox. You only get them once because you got that manual already in the body.
Yes, or any vaccine, right? So someone asked me about the flu at 8:30 this morning, and so the flu vaccine doesn't have the live virus, right? It has a heat-killed virus, but those viral remnants have the antigen still there. So basically, you're injecting yourself with viral antigen. And so what happens is the body realizes this is something foreign. It'll produce the antibodies so that if you do come in contact with the live virus, then hopefully your body will recognize those antigens and will then ramp up the antibody production to target the virus for destruction so that you don't have full-blown flu, right? Okay, and that's really for any sort of vaccine, all right? Any questions on leukocytes? Okay. Thrombocytes or platelets, all right, so here is a picture of a blood smear. So all of these sort of hollowed out donut looking cells, those are your red blood cells, so they're obviously the most numerous. All right, all of these are the different types of white blood cells, and then here in the circle you've got these weird fragments, all right, that don't even look cellular in nature, but those are actually those platelets. Platelets are actually derived from larger cells called megakaryocytes. And so at some point these large cells will kind of start to break apart, and those parts that come off of that megakaryocyte are the platelets. Okay? Platelets are important, all right, in terms of when you've got some sort of tissue injury and you start having some blood loss. Platelets will come together and form what's called a platelet plug. All right, that's like putting if you've got like a pipe with a hole that's leaking out water, that's like putting some sort of putty in that hole in the hopes to dampen the loss of that water, all right, in this case of blood. The second thing that will happen is that once this platelet plug is formed, all right, other things will come in to kind of form a more permanent seal called a clot, all right. So that, in that case, that's putting the putty in for your platelet plug and then putting Flexi-Seal tape over that plug. That's a little bit more permanent in terms of stopping the loss of fluid, all right. Any questions about platelets? All right, so how do we manage to produce all these various formed elements? And that's through a process called hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis is derived from some sort of stem cell in your bone marrow, all right? And that stem cell can further divide into two lines. There's a myeloid stem cell line, then there's a lymphoid stem cell line. Lymphoid stem cells will give rise to the lymphocytes that can produce antibodies. The myeloid stem cell line gives rise to all the other cells that are in those formed elements. So your red blood cells, here's your megakaryocyte broken apart to make platelets, and then all of your baso, eosinophil, and neutrophils are derived from this myeloid stem cell, okay? And so myeloid tissue typically resides in bone marrow, all right? Lymphocytes can originate in bone marrow, but then they'll mature in other tissue, lymphoid tissue, so they are part of the lymphatic system. Places like the thymus, all right? We talked briefly, like 5 seconds, about the thymus gland that sits right above your heart. And basically, some of those lymphocytes immature lymphocytes go to the thymus gland, where the thymus gland secretes thymosin. I know I've used that one before. And so thymosin is important for the maturation of lymphocytes. All right, your lymphatic system has a bunch of swellings called lymph nodes. So those are jam-packed with lymphocytes. And so if you have some sort of infection, your doctor kind of palpates your lymph nodes, and if there's swelling, that might indicate that there's some sort of infection going on. All right, your tonsils and your spleen are also places that can house various lymphocytes. Okay. Now, in order to produce red blood cells. Remember, red blood cells have a shelf life of roughly 120 days. All right, and so usually the stimulus for increasing red blood cells is a decreased blood oxygen level. All right, think about going out to Colorado or climbing Mount Everest. All right, if you've ever been to Colorado, you've reached a significant high altitude. All right, and sometimes it takes a while to acclimate to a decreased oxygen content in that particular altitude, or at that particular altitude. And that's why you kind of maybe feel a little bit woozy, maybe a little bit dizzy. All right, your body is trying to ramp up the production of red blood cells. The more red blood cells you have, the likelihood that you're going to have a better oxygen saturation in the body. The reason why Mount Everest has so many base camps, all right, is so that those climbers can acclimate to a decreased oxygen content in the atmosphere. So decreased oxygen blood oxygen is going to be your stimulus. Oddly enough, it's going to tell your kidneys to start secreting a hormone. So here's where endocrine kind of rears its ugly head again. It secretes a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin's target is the bone marrow. All right? It tells those cells to start increasing the production of red blood cells that will make it into the bloodstream. Okay? Once you have enough and red blood cells, and you supposedly have a higher oxygen content in your blood, then you've got negative feedback, just like always. All right? Any questions on erythropoietin? Okay. Leukocytes, their process is called leukapheresis, and typically leukapheresis occurs one of two ways. The first way is through cytokines, and cytokines, we could spend a whole semester on cytokines, and thankfully we're not. Cytokines are this huge class of signaling molecules. They are going to be important for any sort of growth process. Right? I spent 5 years talking about a cytokine that stimulates the growth of new blood vessels. So cytokines equals growth of something. In this case, it's going to be the growth or cell division of white blood cells. All right? That's one way. The second way is any sort of tissue injury is going to automatically be a stimulus to ramp up white blood cell production. Okay? So those are your two stimuli right there. In order to increase platelet count, all right, it goes through a similar process. All right, you need some sort of signaling molecule. That's typically one called thrombopoietin, which is it acts very similarly to erythropoietin. That's all you need to know. All right? All right. Any questions about formed elements? Okay. All right. Does everybody know their blood type? No? Oh. Okay. Well, you can donate blood next Wednesday. They'll tell you what your blood type is.
Once
You don't
again,
test
another
it right
shameless
there.
plug.
You don't test it right there.
Always
How do you
trying
find
to
out if it's
get
positive or negative?
You have to have a blood test done.
No.
I have a question. Okay, it's relevant to blood.
Well, they don't test it right there, but if you give blood, they will eventually tell you.
So let's say you've had mono.
Okay?
Is it good? Like, does that stay in your bloodstream? Because I know it goes dormant.
It does go dormant. I don't know enough
Mono?
about mono. I went up.
I want to say if it's in your system,
You have you would have to state it, right?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't necessarily, if you give blood, all they really wanna know is where have you been,
Right.
right? So, if you have tattoos, that sort of thing.
They test everything else just
Yeah.
to make sure.
Right,
Um,
like I know they touched
But
that.
I mean, I know it stays dormant, but I don't know where it stays dormant.
Okay.
Can we do one?
Yeah, you could probably Google it. I'm not even gonna try to think about it. Anyway, so how can you figure out your blood type? Well, obviously a blood test. How do they figure that out? All right, they look at two things. All right, one is, as I said, all, so it could stay dormant in your salivary
Like for
glands.
18 months it stays dormant, I think, or like you can still.
It says it becomes inactive after that.
Yeah.
You can be
Like
contagious for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So all cells, including red blood cells, have those same, or not the same, but similar identification markers called antigens. All right. So there are three. There is A antigen, B antigen, and something called Rh antigen or Rh factor. Okay. That is slightly different, so I'll hold off on that part. All right. And so you can either have type A blood, which is what I am. All right. So for someone who is type A, on the cell surface of their red blood cells, they present the A antigen. Okay. What that means is they also produce antibodies against the B antigen. So if anybody here is type B, you can't be my donor. All right. So this anti-B antibodies that I carry, if I get blood through a transfusion, accidentally being type B, then my antibodies will recognize the B antigen. That's incompatible. That could cause serious problems if I were to have a transfusion with the wrong blood type. Okay? Someone who has type B has the B antigen presented on their red blood cells. And also, they will be producing antibodies, anti-A antibodies. So, on the flip side, if that donor needs a blood transfusion, if that person who has B needs a blood transfusion, I cannot be his or her donor because of that incompatibility. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? All right. Now, there are folks out there who are type AB. So what does that mean? That means on the surface of their red blood cells, they present both types of antigens, both A and B. All right? That makes them a little special because they don't produce any antibodies against these two antigens. So someone who is type AB is known as the universal recipient when it comes to blood transfusions because they don't produce antibodies, so they can have type A blood, type B blood as their donor blood, okay? As well as type O, okay? Type O is also special because the red blood cells of someone who has type O doesn't have any antibodies on the surface, or antigens on the surface of their red blood cells. Antigens, okay? However, they produce both anti-A and anti-B antibodies. That's a lot of A's, okay? So someone who is type O, because they don't present any antigens, they are the universal donor. So if you're type O, boy, your blood is super special. It's like the most needed blood type because anybody can get type O blood. All right. Now, if you are type O and you need a blood transfusion, the only blood type you can receive is type O. Do you know why? Can you take a guess?
Fight off the others.
I'm sorry?
There's nothing for it to.
The others, your blood will fight.
Why?
It's got antibodies for the rest.
It has,
Antibodies for everything.
okay, very good. All right. So that's the eight, yeah, do you have a question?
I'm just like, I just don't understand how, like, why they're scored for that, I don't know. It's something I've never understood about this, I've seen it so many times.
Oh, it's just whether,
Like, why?
Why?
Why? Yeah, there's not really an answer, there just
well, it's
is.
like, why are there so many different eye colors?
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
the Lord wanted it.
Because Jesus said so.
I mean, it's all about, genetics, that's just a whole nother
And
ballgame.
that, my head hurts.
Well, this is the closest to genetics you're gonna get.
That's why they make color contacts, you can fix it however you want.
Huh?
So that's why they make color contacts, you can fix it whatever you want.
Grass
Alright.
green, one's got blue.
So when they check like your blood, like what type you are, is there a certain test they do or?
Yeah, they're gonna look to see what antigens you're presenting, or if you're not presenting antigens.
I just didn't know if they were like doing like a different.
It's a typing screen.
How fast are those results?
In 30 minutes if they're stopped.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know my blood type until I gave birth to my son and I saw it in my discharge papers. I didn't know that they drug test you too. So I'm like, oh, negative for meth, cocaine. Well, that's good to know. Yeah, that I didn't know either. I do remember them drawing blood, but I'm like, oh, okay, maybe they just need to make sure it was
We're not
okay.
supposed to tell you.
I know they're not, but you know, my mind's like, oh, they're just gonna take my glucose reading because I had gestational diabetes. But no, I looked at my discharge papers. I'm like, well, that's good to know. Of
People
course, it's
ask me, and I'm
negative.
just like, oh, the doctor wanted it.
Huh?
People just ask me, I'm like, I don't know, the doctor wanted it.
Yeah, I didn't ask questions. Anyway, I just read my discharge papers and there it was. So I knew from there that was my blood type, type A, positive. All right. Now, so yes, if you get the wrong type, then two things can happen. One is something called agglutination, which is basically those red blood cells that are attacked clump together. Oh, that's not going to help you at all. All right. The second way is something called hemolysis. Hemo meaning blood, lysis meaning to break apart. So these red blood cells from the donor essentially go kaput, they burst, rupture. All right. Well, that's not good either. All right. So blood compatibility is very, very important. All right. And they probably learned that the hard way. All right. Now, this plus minus system, okay, that's dependent on the RH antigen or RH factor. Also, I already talked about this. Do I need to go over this slide? No. Okay, good. All right.
What's the recipient meaning? The universal recipient?
It means type AB because they have both antigens and no antibodies. That means they can receive blood from anybody.
Okay.
O is the universal donor for the opposite reason.
But the RH has to be like negative or positive, right?
Yes. If you are RH positive, you can receive both negative and positive blood. I'm not sure about those who are negative, however. That only becomes an issue if you're pregnant, but we'll talk about that too. Okay, so RH typing determines the presence or the absence of the RH antigen. So if you have the antigen, you're RH positive, all right? To my knowledge, this really only becomes a concern when you're pregnant and you, the mother-to-be, is RH negative, okay? So if you were to have your first pregnancy, in your first pregnancy, maybe you don't know, obviously you might not know the blood type, and so it doesn't really, I guess, matter for the first pregnancy. So if you are pregnant with your first child and it just so happens to be RH positive, okay? And that's not so much of a concern for that particular baby, right? Remember during during pregnancy, all right, maternal and fetal blood mix, okay? So here at the top, all right, is sort of representative of maternal blood at the top in red, fetal blood in the bottom, also in red, and that green, the chorion, just kind of think of as a layer of the placenta, all right? And so fetal blood and maternal blood mix at some point in this process. And so if you have an Rh positive fetus, all right, some of those red blood cells make it to maternal circulation, all right? And so what happens is that the body, the mom's body, will recognize that particular antigen as something foreign. And so what do you do when you see something foreign? You start producing antibodies, okay? For the fetus, that particular fetus, that's not so much of an issue. It's only when this Rh negative mother becomes pregnant again with another Rh fetus, Rh positive fetus, okay? And so what happens is her body remembered that antigen, okay, from her first child, from her first pregnancy. And so she'll start ramping up antibody production that can attack the second fetus's red blood cell, all right, causing it to lyse, all right, break apart. And that's a disease called hemolytic disease of the newborn, all right? And so usually, I don't believe I was already Rh positive, so it doesn't really matter. But usually, if those of you who have more than one child, maybe you know, they'll give you Rogam, which sort of negates that reaction, okay?
How do they tell, like, you know, when you become like a certain amount of weeks pregnant and they can tell the gender?
Mm-hmm.
How do they tell that by blood? Like, what do they look at?
So oddly enough, some of the fetus's chromosomes make it to maternal circulation. Yeah, so they can, if you are, it's a lot easier if your fetus is a boy, but that could be one of the markers is just to look at fetal chromosomes that circulate in blood, in the maternal blood. Otherwise, I don't know any other way to determine that. So I tried it actually, and they couldn't tell. And I'm like, but I had a boy, so you know, it should have been like pretty obvious. So yeah, that didn't work out. Okay. Yeah. Side note, I'll go on a tangent since I'm a little ahead. There was actually an article that some of those chromosomes can make it to the mom's brain. They can actually stain for fetal chromosomes even years after mom has had her pregnancies. And it's thought that having fetal chromosomes in the mom's brain, in brain tissue, can actually either increase their chances of the mother getting Alzheimer's disease. That was, yeah, that was, I mean, there wasn't any correlation, so there's no strong cause and effect, but they are kind of hinting in that direction.
Do they just like test that like once the person's like passed? Like how do you test that? Like if it's on the brain?
Oh, for Alzheimer's, you have to do it post-mortem.
Yeah, I figured.
Yeah.
I was like, there's no way they're doing that. Like
No, it has to be post-mortem.
I know it's kind of off topic, but like, how do you get like diabetes when you're pregnant and you've never had diabetes before?
It's a hormonal thing. So, you know, usually, to be diagnosed for any version of diabetes, you're going to have a higher resting blood glucose, right? So if you fall between 70 and 120, that would have been really cool if I caught it. That would be, then you fall within the normal range. If you're above 120, then that's indicative of diabetes. You know, a lot of things can happen. You know, if you are slightly overweight before you got pregnant, like I was, because I had gestational diabetes. But a lot of it will have to do with hormonal changes that kind of affect insulin signaling. All right, and so something happens. It might be the estrogen, increased estrogen, that can kind of inhibit insulin, your cells being receptive to insulin. So where you're still producing it, but you're not responding to it. So if you're not responding to it, then your cells aren't taking as much glucose, and so glucose hangs around in the blood. Now, for someone who has gestational diabetes during pregnancy, that can certainly go away after pregnancy, as it did in my case. So, but that does also increase your risk for getting diabetes.
Oh my god.
For getting, thank you.
Don't drop that.
For getting diabetes in later in life. So it's probably going to be some sort of hormonal change, and well, it has to be. I mean, a lot of things, crazy things happen in pregnancy. So where your body kind of readjusts itself in terms of insulin signaling. So yes, you don't have to already have diabetes to have gestational. It just kind of rears its ugly head and pops out of nowhere. Okay? All right. That was very off topic, but I appreciate the question. All right.
Yeah.
Next. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, in order, if you have some sort of tissue or vascular injury, all right, and you're bleeding, all right, then that process to stop bleeding is called hemostasis. Hemo, blood, stasis, kind of even keel, or in this case, stop. And that occurs in 3 stages, okay? The first one is called vasospasm, or another fancy word is vasoconstriction. An easier way to remember it is the blood vessel diameter decreases, all right? And so, well, if you've got blood loss, of course, the first thing you're gonna do is kind of clamp that blood vessel so that no more blood is spilling out, right? Well, another thing that happens during vasospasm is that where that site of injury is taking place, these blood vessels are already sending out signals to start this homeostasis process. All right, that can be anything from inflammatory signaling, that could be anything from telling those white blood cells to start mobilizing and coming to that site of injury. The second thing is something called platelet plug formation. Platelets, on any given day, when there is no injury whatsoever, are actually repelled by that vascular wall. So here's a cross section, right? Here is the vascular wall, all right? This is connective tissue down here. Here's where blood, these are your little platelets, although they do look like red blood cells. These are platelets in this case, okay? And so the cells of the vascular wall actually send out signals that tell these platelets, don't come near the cell wall, the vascular wall, all right? And so when you have a vascular injury of some sort, all right, where you've got damage to a blood vessel, blood is